In the dying days of the Third Reich, as the world outside crumbled, Hitler's focus narrowed to the fate of his beloved dog, Blondie. The once mighty dictator, now trapped beneath the ruins of Berlin, found solace in the simple companionship of his German shepherd. In the dim, claustrophobic corridors of the Führer bunker, Blondie became a rare source of comfort, a living reminder of a world that was rapidly slipping away. Yet even this bond was tainted by the shadow of death that hung over every corner of the bunker. On a battered table, cyanide capsules lay in wait, their deadly promise meant not only for Hitler and his inner circle but for Blondie as well. These small, unassuming pills represented the final act of control in a world spiraling into chaos, a grim insurance policy against capture and humiliation. Above the Führer bunker, Berlin was collapsing under relentless Soviet artillery. The city, once the heart of a vast empire, was now encircled and burning, its streets reduced to rubble and ash. The thunder of explosions and the roar of advancing tanks echoed through the ground, shaking the very foundations of the bunker below. Inside, the bunker's inhabitants lived in a world of perpetual twilight, cut off from the sun and the hope it once brought. The air was thick with anxiety, every distant boom a reminder that the end was drawing closer. Families huddled together, their faces etched with fear and exhaustion, as the sounds of battle became a constant, inescapable presence. Hitler, increasingly isolated and delusional, clung desperately to routines and fantasies. He spent hours poring over maps, moving imaginary armies that no longer existed, issuing orders to generals who could do nothing to change the inevitable. His rage at their failures was a hollow echo, reverberating through the bunker's narrow halls as reality slipped further from his grasp. The bunker became an echo chamber, cut off from the outside world, where the rituals of daily life continued with a sense of grim futility. Meals were eaten in silence, letters were written that would never be sent, and conversations circled endlessly around rumors and fears. Each day felt like a repetition of the last, a slow march toward an unavoidable fate. The air was thick with fear, despair, and the stench of defeat. Faces grew gaunt and eyes hollow, as hope drained away with every passing hour. The sense of impending doom was palpable, pressing down on everyone like the weight of the earth above. Each day, the walls shook, not just from the relentless shelling above, but from the collapse of Hitler's fantasy world. The physical tremors mirrored the psychological unraveling within, as the last vestiges of the regime crumbled in the darkness. The end was inevitable and everyone inside knew it. In those final days, hope was replaced by resignation, and the tremor of a distant war became the drumbeat of their own demise. The Führer bunker was a labyrinth of concrete and steel, buried deep beneath the shattered streets of Berlin. Concealed from the devastation above, it was constructed as the ultimate refuge for Adolf Hitler and his closest circle, a last redoubt designed to shield Nazi leaders from the relentless destruction raining down on the city. The bunker's location was no accident. Hidden beneath the Reich Chancellery Gardens, it was meant to be impenetrable, a fortress within a fortress, where the fate of the Third Reich would be decided in secrecy and shadow. Its thick, reinforced walls, several meters of concrete, were engineered to withstand the heaviest Allied bombs. Yet inside, the recycled air and constant hum of machinery created a sterile, claustrophobic environment. The bunker was more tomb than fortress, a place where the outside world was reduced to distant echoes and trembling walls. The air was heavy, tinged with the scent of damp concrete and fear, and every footstep seemed to reverberate with the weight of impending doom. Days and nights blurred together under the harsh, unyielding glare of electric lights. There was no sunrise or sunset, only the relentless ticking of clocks and the monotony of routine. People clung to their duties, performing tasks out of habit rather than hope, as the world above collapsed. The sense of time faded, replaced by a growing sense of dread and resignation. Officers and staff, their faces drawn and pale from lack of sunlight and sleep, gathered in the main passageway. They issued orders and relayed messages for a Reich that had shrunk to a few desperate city blocks. The once mighty command structure was now reduced to whispers in the gloom as the reality of defeat pressed in from all sides. The bunker, intended as a command center, became a pressure cooker of fear, anxiety, and despair. Tensions ran high as the situation outside deteriorated, and every decision carried the weight of impending catastrophe. The walls seemed to close in, amplifying every argument, every whispered doubt, every unspoken fear. Alcohol became a common escape, dulling the terror and numbing the senses. Officers and staff drank to forget the chaos above and the hopelessness below, but no amount of liquor could mask the psychological disintegration that was taking hold. The bunker's atmosphere grew heavier with each passing day, as morale crumbled and the end drew near. The outside world faded into a distant memory. Only the constant hum of generators, the crackle of radios, and the muffled thunder of distant explosions reminded those inside that a war was still raging above. The city was dying, and with it, the dreams of those entombed below. In the end, the bunker did not protect Hitler from the consequences of his actions. Instead, it isolated him from reality, entombing him in defeat and delusion. Surrounded by loyalists and sycophants, he became a solitary figure, haunted by the collapse of his empire and the inevitability of his downfall. The Führer bunker was not a fortress of power, but a self-imposed prison, a concrete tomb for a regime in its death throes, where hope had vanished and only the echoes of defeat remained. By April 1945, Hitler was a broken man, stooped, trembling, and barely recognizable. His health had deteriorated rapidly, plagued by Parkinson's symptoms and a cocktail of dubious medications from Dr. Morell. The once mesmerizing orator was now a frail figure, his voice weak, his rages unpredictable. His daily briefings became spectacles of delusion, demanding impossible counterattacks from phantom armies. Paranoia consumed him, he trusted no one, seeing betrayal everywhere. Staff tiptoed around his violent mood swings, never knowing what to expect. Hitler's world had shrunk to the bunker, his mind besieged by fear and suspicion. The master of Germany was now a prisoner of his own body and mind. The collapse was total, physical, mental, and moral. Hitler's final days were spent with a loyal, doomed court. Eva Braun, Joseph and Magda Goebbels, their children, generals, aides and secretaries. Eva Braun tried to maintain normalcy, her cheerfulness a stark contrast to the despair around her. The Goebbels family embodied fanaticism, preparing for collective suicide rather than surrender. Generals and staff performed their duties mechanically, witnesses to the regime's last act. Secretaries like Traudl Junge recorded history as it happened, their memoirs later revealing the surreal mix of routine and horror. This captive audience watched as Hitler's world and their own collapsed. As the Red Army closed in and Berlin crumbled under relentless bombardment, Hitler's paranoia reached fever pitch. The city, once the heart of his empire, was now a landscape of devastation and despair. In these final days, Hitler's thoughts turned inward, consumed by suspicion and a growing sense of betrayal. This paranoia culminated in the infamous Nero Decree, an order that demanded the destruction of Germany's own infrastructure, railways, bridges, factories and utilities. Hitler insisted that if he could not have victory, then Germany itself should not survive for the Allies to claim. The decree was a desperate, nihilistic act, reflecting his willingness to sacrifice his own nation in the name of vengeance. Yet, not everyone was willing to follow him into the abyss. Albert Speer, Hitler's trusted architect and minister of armaments, quietly sabotaged the order. Risking his life, Speer instructed officials to delay or ignore the destruction, ultimately saving countless lives and preserving what little remained of Germany's future. In these moments, the regime's unity began to unravel. Hitler's obsession with betrayal intensified as he learned of Göring's attempt to assume leadership, interpreting it as a coup rather than a contingency plan. Meanwhile, Himmler's secret negotiations with the Allies for peace only deepened Hitler's sense of isolation and treachery within his inner circle. The atmosphere in the bunker grew thick with suspicion. Distrust and fear replaced the camaraderie that once held the Nazi leadership together. Every glance, every whisper seemed to confirm Hitler's belief that he was surrounded by traitors. Hitler's rage at these traitors was explosive, erupting in furious tirades and accusations. He lashed out at those around him, blaming them for Germany's collapse. But as the days dragged on and defeat became inevitable, his anger faded, replaced by a heavy resignation and apathy. The man who once commanded millions now sat alone, broken and exhausted. The sense of isolation deepened with each passing hour. The bunker, once filled with bustling activity, became a tomb of silence and despair. Hitler saw himself as utterly alone, convinced that no one remained loyal, that everyone had abandoned him in his darkest hour. The faces of those he once trusted now seemed distant, their loyalty erased by fear, self-preservation, or ambition. The bonds that had held the Nazi elite together were shattered beyond repair. These betrayals were the final blows to Hitler's psyche, compounding his sense of doom and sealing his fate. Each new act of disloyalty was a reminder that his power and his world were slipping away. As April 1945 wore on, the ticking clock in the bunker echoed the collapse of the Third Reich. Hitler became convinced that his end was not only near, but inevitable. The destruction he ordered across Germany was more than military strategy. It was a reflection of his own nihilism, a final act of spite against a world he believed had betrayed him. In the end, Hitler's world was reduced to ashes, his dreams, his empire, and his relationships all consumed by the fires of war and betrayal. The final days in the bunker were marked by a profound sense of loss, as Hitler was left with nothing but the ruins of his ambitions and the bitter memory of those he once called friends. In the early hours of April 29, Hitler married Eva Braun in a brief, somber ceremony inside the bunker. The wedding was a surreal parody of normalcy, witnessed by Goebbels and Bormann, as Soviet shells thundered above. Eva's loyalty was absolute. Her decision to die with Hitler was her final act of devotion. For Hitler, the marriage was a symbolic gesture, rewarding her faithfulness and rebuking the men he saw as traitors. The grim celebration was short-lived. Champagne was served, but the mood was funereal. Hitler soon retreated to dictate his final testaments, preparing for the end. The marriage was less about love than about loyalty and legacy. Their union was a final, private act before the darkness closed in. After the wedding, Hitler dictated his last will and political testament, documents filled with blame, self-pity, and delusion. He expelled Göring and Himmler, appointed Dönitz as his successor, and insisted on death over surrender. His private will detailed the distribution of his belongings and the cremation of his and Eva's bodies. With the paperwork done, Hitler and Eva said their farewells to the bunker's remaining occupants. The atmosphere was heavy with grief and disbelief. Tears flowed as Hitler shook hands and Eva offered quiet encouragement. For those present, it was the end of everything they had known. Hitler and Eva retreated to their suite, the steel door closing behind them. The final act was about to begin. In their private suite, Eva Braun took cyanide, dying quietly on the sofa. Hitler followed, shooting himself in the head with his pistol. The muffled gunshot was heard in the corridor. Silence followed, then frantic activity. Valet Heinz Linge and Martin Bormann entered to find both dead. Hitler slumped, blood pooling, the smell of gunpowder and cyanide in the air. The bodies were quickly wrapped and carried upstairs to the ruined Chancellery garden. Amid shellfire, they were placed in a shallow crater, doused with petrol, and set alight. Flames consumed the remains as the city above burned. The man who set the world on fire ended in a makeshift pyre. The Führer was gone. The spell was broken. The survivors were left to face the ruins. News of Hitler's death shattered the bunker's discipline. Some, like the Goebbels, chose suicide. Others plotted escape. The Nazi regime, promised to last 1,000 years, collapsed in 12. Admiral Dönitz took command, focusing on surrender rather than resistance. Hitler's suicide ended the war in Europe, allowing the world to begin healing. His death prevented a public reckoning but also closed the darkest chapter of the century. The flames in the Chancellery garden symbolized the end of a regime built on hatred and delusion. From the ashes, a devastated continent began the long process of rebuilding.